History remembers Rome for its power, discipline, and order, but in 135 BCE, in the heart of Sicily, that order would collapse. Enslaved men and women who were beaten, branded, and forgotten would form an army and take control of an entire Roman city. In today's video, we'll have a look at how a slave uprising led to the capture and rule of a piece of the empire. Sicily's slave society. By the 2nd century BCE, Sicily wasn't only a Roman province, it was Rome's stomach. The empire depended on it for grain, and every harvest from those endless fields kept the citizens of Rome fed and the republic stable. But behind the comfort was an island that was built on suffering. After the Punic Wars, Rome had rewarded its generals and senators with land, vast estates that were carved out of conquered territory. The rich got richer, small farmers who once worked their own plots would lose everything. They then moved to the cities or starved, and to replace them, Rome turned to slavery. Tens of thousands of people, including Greeks, Syrians, and Africans, were dragged to Sicily in chains, war captives, debtors, children born to bondage, and by 135 BCE, in some regions, enslaved people outnumbered the free by as much as 10 to 1. These estates weren't quite farms, they were industrial operations which included grain, olives, and livestock, all run by armed overseers with whips. Slaves lived in filthy huts, fed themselves on scraps, and were often beaten to death for their mistakes. Women were used, sold, and killed without question. Sicily became a landscape of cruelty, a world where human life was cheap and rage was cheapened further. Enslaved men and women spoke dozens of languages, came from different lands, and were forbidden to organize. But they shared one common thing: misery that was deep enough to turn into fire. To the Romans, Sicily was a loyal province, but anyone looking closely could see what it really was: a powder keg that was waiting for a spark. The spark and rise of Eunice. Every explosion begins with a single spark. In Sicily, that was a man named Eunice, a Syrian slave owned by a wealthy Roman in the city of Enna. On the surface, he seemed to be harmless, an entertainer, a jester, someone who was brought out during banquets to amuse his masters. However, Eunice had something that others didn't have: a reputation for prophecy. He claimed to hear voices from a goddess, and he'd speak of visions where the slaves would one day rule their own masters. The Romans had laughed and even asked him half-jokingly if he'd spare them when his visions came true. Around 138 BCE, a group of desperate slaves came to Eunice in secret. They were planning a revolt and wanted a sign, a divine approval for what they were about to do. Eunice told them the goddess had spoken and that Enna would fall. The prophecy gave them something they'd never had before: belief. By 135 BCE, that belief would turn to action. About 400 slaves rose up under Eunice's lead, storming Enna while killing the Roman elite in a violent and chaotic revolt. The massacre became total but calculated. Craftsmen like blacksmiths were spared to forge weapons for what came next. After the bloodshed, Eunice would crown himself Antiochus the King, taking the name from the Seleucid kings of his homeland. To his followers, he wasn't just a man anymore, he was chosen. And for the first time, a slave sat on a throne in a Roman city. Cleon and the expansion. While Eunice's rebels fortified Enna in the center of the island, the south of Sicily was already burning. There, another name was whispered with equal parts fear and awe: Cleon, a Sicilian slave known for his brute strength and savage courage. Once a shepherd and now a killer, he had seen enough cruelty to understand there was no mercy that was left to beg for. Within weeks, he had turned fury into an army. Nearly 5,000 slaves, men who had plowed fields and tended vineyards, now marched behind him, armed with stolen blades, farming tools, and sheer rage. They tore through the countryside, burning estates while slaughtering overseers, and seizing one of Sicily's richest and most fortified cities. The Roman landlords fled or were impaled as a warning. In Rome, the Senate could only watch in disbelief. Two slave armies, one under a self-proclaimed prophet, the other under a warlord, now ruled half of Sicily. Surely, they thought, greed and ego would destroy them, and surely these men would turn on each other. However, Cleon did the unthinkable. Instead of challenging Eunice, he swore allegiance to him, The prophet became king in name, Cleon his general in truth. Together they would build a machine that Rome had never seen from its slaves, disciplined, ruthless, and united by vengeance. The rebellion would roll east, Catana fell, and then Tauromenium. Each victory would bring food, weapons, and recruits. Freed men and runaway slaves flooded in, swelling their ranks into the tens of thousands, and for a moment it looked as though Sicily itself had broken its chains. What had begun as an uprising of the desperate had now become a full-scale war, one that made Rome tremble, not with pity, but with the cold realization that its empire could bleed from within. Rebel governance and symbolism. This was no longer a mob of runaway slaves. Sicily was turning into a kingdom of the enslaved. Enna, the heart of the rebellion, became their capital, a city ruled by people who had once been bought and sold in its markets. Eunice didn't just fight Rome, he had tried to replace it. He minted small bronze coins stamped with his own royal name and surrounded himself with a council, guards, and advisors. He spoke not only as a rebel, but as a monarch reborn, modeling himself after the kings of his own native Syria. And behind all of it, he claimed divine sanction. Eunice said that a goddess, whom he identified with Sicily and Rome's own goddesses, had guided his visions, and to his followers, it wasn't only about vengeance, it was a prophecy that was fulfilled. Yet even prophets face reality. Grain had to be stored, weapons needed to be forged, and armies fed. The rebellion's early fire met the cold grind of logistics. Even in freedom, order became fragile. The same land that had once sustained Rome's own wealth had now strained under the weight of its own uprising. Cleon, ever the soldier, had pushed for constant warfare to keep discipline intact, while Eunice had tried to balance faith with governance. Some slaves began to see themselves not as equals, but as rulers of a new hierarchy, a bitter irony for a revolution that was born in chains. Raiding parties scoured the countryside for food and weapons, clashing even with villages that had once offered shelter. As winter set in, Sicily's rebellion began to fracture under its own ambition, but the fire it had lit could no longer be contained. Rumors of a slave king ruling in Sicily spread across the Mediterranean. Roman merchants had fled to the island, and letters from desperate landowners reached the Senate. Tales of estates being burned, of Roman citizens impaled, and of coins bearing the face of a foreign king were more than rebellion now. It became humiliation for Rome. Roman reaction and military pushback. At first, Rome had simply laughed it all off. The Senate had seen uprisings before. There were bandits and deserters, runaway slaves with stolen blades, but Sicily refused to bend. The early commanders, sent to crush the revolt, underestimated them completely. Isolated contingents of Roman troops were ambushed and slaughtered in the hills. Entire villages loyal to Rome were now wiped out. Each report that reached the capital brought more disbelief, and then anger. How could the Republic, master of the known world, lose its own province to slaves? Senators began to whisper of divine punishment, of a curse upon Rome's own arrogance. Praetors were dispatched one after another, each promising swift victory, each returning defeated or not at all. Their legions, who were ill-prepared for guerrilla warfare and unmotivated to die on foreign soil, fell to disciplined slave armies that fought with the desperation of the condemned. Local militias were slaughtered. Sicily's fields and Rome's breadbasket had become a graveyard of Roman pride. By 134 BCE, the situation could no longer be dismissed as a mere insurrection. Rome declared a full consular campaign. Veteran generals were sent with hardened troops, siege engineers, and naval blockades to starve the island into submission. The strategy would shift from open battle to attrition. Rome knew that it could not match the rebels' fury, but it could outlast them. Supply routes were cut off, rebel envoys were intercepted, and cities that had once cheered the uprising now closed their gates, fearing the revenge of Rome. Starvation became a weapon, and treachery replaced battle. Sicily, once a land of abundance, had now turned into a wasteland of suspicion and betrayal. The same slaves who had tasted freedom now fought not for victory, but for their own survival. The empire had woken up, and it was coming to erase everything the slaves had built. Sieges and the fall of strongholds. For years, the rebels had defied the impossible, but even revolutions grow tired. The fire that had consumed the island was now burning itself out. Hunger, disease, and the weight of Roman vengeance closed in from every direction. The Roman general Publius Rupilius took command of the final campaign. His orders became clear: no mercy, no compromise, and one by one the rebel strongholds fell. Taormina was among the last to break. The city's defenders had held out for months, perhaps longer, living on scraps and hope. And when starvation finally overcame loyalty, traitors inside would open the gates. The Romans poured in, and what followed was not a victory, it was an extermination. Every captured slave would be tortured and hurled from the city's cliffs. Rome wanted to make an example that was so horrific, no one would ever dream of a rebellion again. But the true heart of the revolt was Enna, where the uprising had begun, but also where it would end. Rupilius surrounded the city with siege works, cutting off all escape, and inside, the remaining rebels who were led by Cleon fought with the ferocity of men who knew their fate. They launched one final breakout, a desperate assault against the impossible odds. Cleon would be struck down in the chaos, dying from his wounds on the battlefield that he had once conquered. Soon afterwards, the walls were breached, not by force, but by betrayal. Eunice fled with a handful of guards, hiding in a pit, and when the Romans found him, the prophet king was no longer a figure of divine power, but a gaunt and broken man. He was dragged to prison, where disease had claimed his life before Rome could even stage his spectacle. What followed would not be justice, but vengeance. Tens of thousands of captured rebels were crucified, their bodies lining Sicily's roads from city to coast. The empire made sure that freedom would hang as a warning for generations. For 3 years, Sicily burned under the rule of those that Rome had enslaved, and when it was over, tens of thousands hung from crosses and the land went quiet once again. But the memory never died. Rome had crushed the revolt, yet they had learned how fragile its order really was.